We moved to Michigan from Indiana when I was 11 years old. Both places had a realist perspective. That is, there was only one acceptable reality or perspective. I believe a portion of realism in culture goes back to the first stage of the Industrial Revolution, or from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century. This began in Great Britain and then would spread to Northwestern Europe and to the US. It seems to me, as the countries of the industrial age advanced beyond others, there was a false sense of confidence that they were superior in all areas. This can be seen in concepts like manifest destiny, which was the US belief that God destined the US to take over, control, and to implement their philosophies and ideologies. While it is true, there are some areas in which the realism culture has a superior understanding, but it was never in everything. Realism believed itself superior racially and ethnically. It believed that other races, ethnicities were barbaric and really animalistic. My father is of Polish descent, and my mother is from Louisiana. The Polish culture, or culture of Louisiana, were thought, like all others, to be inferior to those of the culture of realism. That is, those of the Anglo-Saxon people of Northwestern Europe or the US. It is, as I know it, the mindset that all things modern are the best way of thinking. This mindset is rigid and closed-minded. Different perspectives, understandings from different cultures, or from most of history, are discouraged. The core, as I know it, teaches you that all things are known within this modernism. It teaches someone to not consider outside that. New discoveries are made because a small percentage of the population has been taught to think, to consider what can be. But even that thinking stays within an expanded version of realism. In Michigan, I became more familiar with the culture of African Americans. Slavery, racism, had done a lot of damage culturally to it, but it seemed more like a magical realism culture than realism, more similar to that of Latin America, my mother's culture of Louisiana, the Native Americans, and many nomadic tribes around the world. I base this belief on my experience and evidence from growing up. In the past videos, I have covered this. Magical realism considered things on the fringes. It knew it didn't know all things. To me, this makes magical realism more real than realism. African Americans in my school district tended to live mostly in one area, which I'll say economically was low middle class to poor. It was gang-ridden, but didn't have the horrible amounts of violence that other areas of Michigan have. The impoverished white community in our school district was another thing. That was one of the worst neighborhoods I've been exposed to, and one in which extreme rage was often found. Most of our school district was upper middle class to wealthy. My family and I lived in a middle to upper middle class neighborhood, but most of the kids in our neighborhood went to a private Christian school. I then had to ride the bus with many from the gang-ridden white areas. Some areas in Michigan are the very worst I have seen in all my travels. I've traveled through many wars, genocide, and other places of extreme violence. But the rage in Michigan in these places seemed the worst of all of them. Rage and violence are common across the United States. Not exactly what you might expect from a country which prides itself on being one of the most advanced in history. The realist culture, as I have experienced it and described it above, believes this rage and violence is inherent, and that these are simply not good people. I'm quite certain that those who have this belief if they were forced to live the lives of those who I've described as enraged, then they would be the same. Magical realism verbal tales has been a common trait among African American and African societies. That's not to say magical realism doesn't exist in the white community. It just isn't a strong part of the culture and is fairly rare. I haven't spent much time exploring the literary community of African Americans, but I suspect there must be some great magical realist writers, as the potential is certainly there. Toni Morrison is one. My lack of acceptance in Indiana would continue in Michigan with being Polish. The poor white and African American communities could care less that I was Polish. Though they were very violent, I felt a stronger connection to them. By ninth grade, virtually all of the poor white students had dropped out of school. The chances of a girlfriend for me in the middle class or higher realist community was slim. I was told being Polish was the reason. In my first 9 years of school, very few teachers treated me well. The ones that did were mostly involved in athletics, as a coach. I was a very good student, and it seemed to bother some of the teachers that this Polish boy was a good student. The majority of these teachers treated me with disgust. Had I been any other race, any other ethnicity outside of Northern European, or been from a lower economic class, I would have been treated worse. I was lucky. One example in which I was harshly judged was the first day of school one year. I had always been in the highest math class. When I walked into this math class, the teacher of the class angrily told me to leave, that I was not in that class. She could not believe that this Polish boy could be talented at math. When I refused and told her I was in the class, she told me to go to the principal's office. I told her she could ask me any question in math and ask another student in the class, and that I would come up with the answer first. A couple of my good friends assured her that I was indeed in the class. She then went to the principal's office. When she came back, she glared at me as if I had done something to her and never acknowledged I was in the class. She just didn't say anything. But I stayed, and certainly enough, I got the highest grade I could. She was never nice, though. To this point, I then felt as if I didn't have a community. I was an outsider at best, and still I had many friends, but there seemed often to be a limit on the level of friendship because of who I was. I was popular in both Indiana and Michigan, but I also knew I probably had reached my max as to acceptance. I could go no higher. My grandfather had experienced the same thing. The president of a very large and well-known company he worked for told him he could go no higher at a point in the company because he was Polish. This was coming from the president, who really liked my grandfather. My grandfather had the abilities and talent to rise higher in that company. The president felt he would be judged for allowing a Polish man to participate in high-level company meetings. Michigan was slightly different than Indiana in the culture of fighting. In Indiana, it was as if we were fighting for our lives. We were fighting to be perfect because we were told we had to be. This mindset that I experienced for the most part didn't exist in Michigan. Maybe this fighting for your life that I describe was fighting to be among the privileged. I define privilege to mean those who don't have to live their lives in a strict form of realism. The strict form of realism taught to not question things, but accept them as they are. Everything was black and white. It was unacceptable in my mind to not be allowed to think. If you were perfect, you were allowed to think. I had to live on the fringes, that of a difference maker, and to consider what things can be. I didn't want to be subjected to a life of mindless repetition. Another aspect that was present in growing up is that it was important who your parents and grandparents were, their professions too, and the amount of money your family had. If you came from generations of wealth, regardless of your abilities, inabilities, or behavior, you were judged highly. You could not fall out of that, even if you tried. Please subscribe and like, as that is how YouTube decides to send it on to others. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day, and see you in the next episode.